Hi, writer. Thank you so much for sending your paper over. My name is Amanda, and I'm going to go over just some of the things I noticed in your paper that I thought were um, the most pressing. And so you'll see I have on the screen, a copy of your paper and the prompt, which is right over here. So this really helped me in terms of what's expected in the paper, what you need to do, um, and then just in terms of comparing, um, I found that helpful. And I think that's a really, good skill to have, just in terms of your own work and comparing what you've written to the prompt. So I definitely want to consider the prompts in this. And there were basically three concerns that I wanted to touch on today. And one was your thesis. And you can see I highlighted in yellow over here your thesis, or what I believe to be your thesis. And then the second concern that I wanted to touch on was the organization of your body paragraphs. So everything after the introduction. And then the third concern I had was your arguments throughout and if they were consistent. Just because I noticed that that was one of the main components of the prompts, which is right over here, develop an argument, be consistent. And I did find some inconsistencies there. So just to start, before I get into those three concerns, one thing in the prompt that caught my eye was here, where it says, the question of context, where would this be seen? Caught my eye. And one thing I noticed was that wasn't really addressed anywhere in your paper. You talk about the actual Hot Wheels ad in this paragraph, and you talk about the audience and what this ad is being advertised to. But there's no real mention of where this ad, was displayed. Was it on a billboard? Was it in a magazine? Was it, on TV? So I think that's a really big deal, when, concerning, where the ad was originally, um, you know, showcased. So I think that's something that you should definitely address somewhere in your paper at least, because I think that would make a big difference in terms of audience and how the ad is being, interpreted by its intended audience. So just something to keep in mind, is that portion of the prompt, the where would this ad even be seen? Okay, so my first major concern in your paper um, was your thesis. So here you see I highlighted it in yellow, and I'll just read it aloud so you can hear it aloud. The Hot Wheels advertisement does not contain enough persuasion because it does not persuade every viewer. So one thing that caught my eye about this thesis is that there's sort of a kind of alliteration going on. You're using the word persuade, so persuasion and persuade, twice in one sentence in the thesis. It's generally a no-no because it starts to sound a little bit repetitive. And I feel like the thesis needs to be expanded upon a little bit more. I'm not really sure what you mean. So I think you're saying that the ad the ad is not very persuasive because it doesn't persuade everyone. So I think that's what you're trying to say, but I feel like if you make the thesis a little bit more specific in terms of viewers who are already aware of Hot Wheels as a brand and viewers who are not, saying something about that differentiation of the audience, I think would help there. I think you do, a, a, a good job in terms of, showing the audience that it ultimately is not very persuasive because it doesn't appeal to everybody or persuade everybody. But then you have to question, is that the intention of an ad? Does the ad have to appeal to everybody to be persuasive, or does it have to appeal to only its intended audience? So that's something that you should probably think about in terms of, what really makes an ad successful or not. But all in all, I think definitely a little bit more information, a little bit more, slightly thorough explanation of what you mean here would be really beneficial. It's okay to say that, it's not persuasive, but then you have to sort of briefly, concisely state to whom, how, why, something to that effect, I think would really help here. So that's the thesis. And so you don't have to worry about, putting all that in one sentence. Sometimes theses can be in two sentences. So, you have a little bit of flexibility there. But the idea is to be concise and short, but also informative in the thesis. You have to have an argument, right? It's your own idea. And you have to make sure that that's your idea and that's what you intend. And then that is what you intend to, ultimately prove, basically, with the claims that you present in your body. So just something to keep in mind for the thesis. Okay, and so my second concern in your paper, it's somewhat related to the thesis, but it's more so the organization of your body paragraphs. So, this paper really isn't very long. I think it's, at least 900 words, which is really, not long at all. And I think you're around 902 words right now. And so it looks like you have, this is your first body paragraph, and this is your second body paragraph, and then here, and then here, and then you have a third body paragraph, and then your conclusion. And one thing I noticed in your three body paragraphs was that it seems like you are kind of flip-flopping between the consumers who are already aware of the Hot Wheels advertisement and or brand, and people, and those consumers who are not aware. And it seems like you're sort of dealing with those two audiences at the same time throughout all of these paragraphs. And so just in terms of like an organization element, just to make it more streamlined, one thing that you might consider is, so like for instance, this first body paragraph here, I think you do an effective job of explaining to somebody who has never seen the ad what the ad actually is. And I think it was smart to keep, one paragraph just solely based off of the visuals in the ad. Keep it, simple. Keep it to the visuals. And so then you're left with two other body paragraphs. So one thing I thought would be interesting that you could try, just for an organizational sense of your paper, so there's some sort of logic here. I think that's really smart. I think it's really important for these kinds of papers, is since you're so concerned with the audience, and you're differentiating between those people who are familiar with Hot Wheels as a brand and people who are not familiar with Hot Wheels as a brand. And you do a thorough job at explaining how this ad is effective to, people who are familiar with the brand, and how there's this sense of nostalgia that comes into play with this with this brand, which I think is a great thing that you touched on. So you do that here in this paragraph, but I underlined this section here where you say all of a sudden new customers will view the ad in a different way. But then you don't really explain what kind of way. And this idea sounds like a whole new sort of paragraph. So one thing I was wondering was, why not, make a paragraph solely devoted to people familiar with the ad and people who are not familiar with the ad. And then you can really break down, well, how do people not familiar with the Hot Wheels ad, how do they view this advertisement? What messages are being evoked for them? And I think that would be really interesting. And I think that would really display your sort of thesis in a way that's, more concrete and like you're actually proving something in your thesis, because your thesis is ultimately, saying it's not effective for everybody, and here's why, and here's what this ad, exudes to this group, and here's what this ad exudes to that group. So why not play with that structure? So just something to think about in terms of that. So just differentiating between those two types of groups or consumers. And so finally, the third concern I had was the inconsistent argument that I noticed. So here in, which paragraph is that? That is the third paragraph here. I highlighted it in green. You say, this is clearly another example of how this advertisement is effective for selling Hot Wheels products to those who understand the image's message. So this seems really inconsistent with your thesis, because you seem to bounce around between saying, like here, its message is clear to its audience. So is it an effective ad? Is it not an effective ad? After reading, your whole paper, I'm not sure where exactly you stand, because at times you say it's effective, but then you say it's not effective to all. So really I'm wondering, what is your definition of what is an effective ad? So that's just something to think about. You don't want to confuse readers in terms of, what you mean. You want to lay it out in a way where the reader knows where you stand, as the writer and as an interpreter. So just something to think about there. And so just as summing up, so in terms of the prompt, definitely address where the ad would be seen somewhere in your paper, maybe in the intro. And then in terms of the thesis, really expand upon your thesis. Add more specifics, differentiate, but make sure you're being concise. You don't want your thesis to be too lengthy either. And then in terms of the organization, try to organize in terms of those familiar with the ad and those who are not. So one paragraph for those who are familiar and one paragraph for those who are not. I think that would be a smart choice. And then finally, just make sure your arguments stay consistent. Make sure you understand what you mean, and then try to define what you think makes an ad successful. Is the ad trying to appeal to everybody, or just trying to appeal to its intended audience? So what really matters when it comes to ads and, selling the product? What is really at stake? And I think that's partly your interpretation, and I think that would be interesting to include somewhere, maybe in the conclusion, just about, what really makes an ad successful. So basically, I hope these comments prove helpful for you. Please let us know if we can answer or clarify anything for you. And, good luck with revising. This was a joy to read. Thank you so much.